It was wonderful. It was relaxing. I got to relax at the same time. It was really good sermons. And people were good. It wasn't super crowded. It was crowded, but not super. So it was good. Everybody was back. I thought it was better. I'm not hearing any bad things. Oh, that's all right. Everybody ignoring that.
Me and Lee's birthday, they got this beer.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll probably look on the Spearable too. I don't think I'm going to go that one too much. So, but I don't know. I could be wrong.
You talk, you know, when it's really loud.
No, I just went up and enjoyed it. Yeah.
But you did last year, too.
I got to help the little kids.
That's what I thought.
So we did a lot of Bible class things. I thought it was great. Phil said he was dead. I was like, I don't see why you're dead. They're just kids. I guess.
How's everyone?
Great.
Good. Very good. Glad to see everyone this evening. Glad to be back after 24 hours on the road. I am glad to be back, finally. We don't have a PowerPoint this evening, but we are going to be covering 3 chapters is my goal tonight, because I do not want to spend a whole class on why did 2 women have a fight over who can have the most babies. So we're going to be looking at a grand view of what happens in the text, and we'll be looking at some greater blessings that we can learn from the text. But before we begin, let's begin with a word of prayer. Brother Jacob is the one who's on the list, but he's not here again. Philip, can you lead us in prayer? Amen. There are certain events in life that we just expect to happen. Birth, can't exist without it. And if you are born into the world, it's implied you also will die at some point. As you get older, there might be an anticipation of birthday parties and or the lack of older parties. Or if you're like a lot of people, you've been the same age for many, many years. And congrats if you're pulling that off with grace. There is the expectation of children going into education, going to school at some point, whether it's homeschool or public school. We expect children as they grow up to be going from preschool to elementary school to middle school, which might be still a part of elementary school. If we think back in the day, there's just primary school and secondary school. But then, there's a call come ringing. And then there is high school. And college. We would expect them to further their education and or go to technical school and or get a job in the manual labor force. Permits. That's kind of something that happens as you get older. Driving, we kind of expect the older you get, if you're going to get from point A to point B, especially if it's really long distances, you're going to get a driver's permit. There are certain things, if not more things, that are expected if one lives. And I want us to consider that there is probably a time in everyone's life, with the exception of one person, where every single person experienced this particular event, but nobody talks about it. What about that time in your life where God was the last thing you wanted to think about? In fact, even the idea of even following God was not even a thought on your radar. And oftentimes it is the case, especially with younger people. People become flustered because they're not getting where they want to go. They're not as good as they want to get, especially when people get older. There's this idea of regrets in life because they, quote unquote, did not get to live life the way they wanted to live life. Well, it's interesting when we look at Genesis 29 to 31 that tonight we're going to be talking about different kind of wages that you and I can be working for. Now, did everybody get a worksheet for tonight? We do have a worksheet. Did everybody get one? No? No? We got one? No? Raise thy hands and Brother Franklin will get it for you. That's his middle name. Huh? I'm a king. James. I'm talking about the Bible translation, not basketball, even though, didn't he go to the Timberwolves recently? Did he finally settle where he's going? LeBron? Huh? Okay, I'll ask him. Oh, okay. Okay. But where do the decisions of our life, where do they end up taking us? Now, something of interest to keep in mind. If you recall what Rachel told Jacob back in chapter 27 and 28, she said, I want you to go up to the land up north. I want you to go live with my brother, find your relatives, and it will be but a few days that you will spend there. Well, lo and behold, we find out that Jacob ends up spending about 20 years within the... a lot of things going crazy. Within the land of Haran. So what seemed to be like a few days ended up transferring into 20 years. And as we look from chapter 29 halfway through, after Jacob has made his way up to Paran-Aram, and he has met Rachel for the first time, and then she brings him home, and he meets Laban, he meets Leah, he meets the whole crew. In fact, there are sons of Laban that are not mentioned. But he meets the whole family. We're going to see that there is a difference between the wages that Laban is going to give to Jacob, which is where our text picks up in chapter 29 and verse number 15, where it ends with Jacob served Laban for about a month, and it picks up with that month afterwards. Should you serve me for no wages? You are a relative, so you should serve me for something. So we're going to look at the wages of Laban, or wages from Laban. Then we're going to be looking at the wages from God. Within the backdrop of this scene is the promise that God made to Jacob at Bethel. I will be with you. I will guide you. You will increase, and you will come back to this land from which you have fled, and you will see that I have blessed you. Now, it's not going to be until chapter 31, 32 that Jacob actually ends up making that exodus of sorts from the north, going down south with his two wives and their two handmaidens, Zilpah and Bilhah. But God keeps his promises. And we're going to see some of the wages that Jacob gets from God. Then we're going to look at this internally, and we're going to see what kind of wages I'm actually working for. It's one thing to actually trust in the employer, but it's another, work for the employer, but it's another thing to actually trust in the employer. And what we're going to find is that even the woman who we would say, yeah, man, that's where the underdog story is. That's where all the blessings are going to come from. God had other plans. And if we're not careful, we might presume, but God, I love this. And we hold this as if it's not this, then God doesn't love me. Well, that's not the case. And we're going to find that when we look at how this ends up working between Leah and Rachel. So in chapter 29 of Genesis, in verse 15 to verse number 30, we are introduced to the second daughter of Laban, who is Leah. Leah is the oldest of the two sisters. Rachel is a little bit younger. It doesn't really give us their ages per se, but it does say that Leah was the firstborn and Rachel was the secondborn. And when this agreement is made, Jacob's coming into this country with nothing, and it could be the case that maybe Laban is thinking, last time someone came into the land looking for a wife, we ended up getting a whole lot of stuff. Well, Jacob didn't have anything. He didn't have any kind of bride price, which is something that was customary during that day. He didn't have anything to give as a voucher or a promise that he was going to take care of his wife, take care of Laban's daughters. But notice in verse 15, Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing?" We're going to come back to that thought when we get to the application. "Tell me, what should your wages be?" Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now, there are different translations for the word delicate. Some may say that she maybe had down eyes, almost like she couldn't quite keep her eyes open. There are other renditions of this text that almost alludes to the way that Solomon alludes to the Shulamite woman. You have eyes like doves. And that's the rendering of this word for delicate. She had very beautiful eyes, but everything else about Leah was not anything to really be attracted toward in a physical sense. Rachel, on the other hand, was very beautiful, very, very fair in appearance. Now, pause. Had there been times already in the book of Genesis where somebody chose what looked better and thought because they chose that, it would turn out better for them? What about Lot? "Oh, look at this green, luscious land. Surely this is where all the blessings are." No, it's not. Abraham got the better part of the deal. When we consider, who else chose things? Melchizedek and the king of Sodom. And Abraham had to choose between those gifts, either blessing the God Most High or blessing the lowercase g, God of this world, so that Abraham could be used as a poker chip of sorts for the king of Sodom. Abraham said, "No, I will serve God. I don't get all these physical things in giving praise to God, but I do in giving the praise to God in the sense there's no immediate reward, but I do have a better reward because my trust is not in the God of flesh. It is the God of the Most High." So yes? Yes, that's true. They should have stayed away from the tree. And it's not that God was tempting them in any way. He told them exactly just like He gives commands to you and I today. They chose to do the wrong thing because they did not put the right barricade or barriers in place. So choices abound throughout the book of Genesis. And this is another case where Jacob is longing for what he says, that is what I want. Nothing wrong with knowing what you want. But there's a difference between knowing what you want and God already knowing and seeing what is going to be better in the outcome of your life that you need to become who you need to be. Now, that's not saying that every single aspect of life is God saying, okay, I want your life to go here, I want it to go here and go here. And by that I mean when we were living in Bloomingdale, there was a steep road and I was riding a scooter and I decided to cut real sharp into the neighbor's driveway, and there was an incline there into the driveway that I did not see. I fell and skinned my elbow. Well, that's not to say that it was God's will that I get on the scooter and skin my elbow. I cannot prove that. But what I did learn from that is that the law of gravity is always abound, and I did not oblige to the law of gravity, nor was I observant of my surroundings. God has given us a mind. And in light of the desires that I have in life, just because I think that's what I need to excel or succeed in life does not mean that's what I actually need. So when we look at this trade that Laban's going to make, he does deceive Jacob. It would say on the wedding night, which brings up a lot of questions, like was there no light anywhere? Which it could just be Leah looked really close to Rachel, but there was a very big difference whenever you saw them in daylight. Laban said, and he pulls out this from his back pocket. Well, it's customary for us to give the firstborn before the secondborn. After he's already worked 7 years for what he thought was going to be Rachel, it turned out to be Leah. And then he goes to Laban, and it's like, what have you done? It's like, well, we have a customary thing. Well, why didn't you say that before? Where was that a problem when we made this agreement to start with? So Laban changed the terms. We know ultimately after 7 days that he ended up marrying Rachel, but in view of that, he had to work another 7 years, work 14 years. And then when we get into chapter 30, we begin to find out that Jacob wants to leave after they have Joseph, their 11th child, and Laban says, no, just stay a little bit longer, a little bit longer. What we end up finding from this text, when we look at chapter 31, verse 7 and 38 and 41, is that Laban changed the terms 10 times what the wages for Jacob were going to be. It does not say in this text that Jacob took advantage of Laban in a negative sense, but because of Laban's oppression, God ended up blessing Jacob through his suffering. Does that sound like another passage you've read in the Old Testament? That God sees those who suffer for righteousness' sake, those who follow the example of Christ, and the outcome for their life is so much better than those that are not willing to endure doing the right thing, even though people in the world are trying to make it more difficult to cause us to fail in doing the right thing. So Laban changes terms 10 times. And Jacob calls him out on it in chapter 31. In fact, as we see again, point B, spanning 20 years, Jacob served in this manner. 7 years for Leah, 7 years for Rachel, and 6 years for the flocks. Now, when you look at the names, it is really easy for us to look at names and their meanings from a 21st century perspective. Don't do that. We have to consider this is a culture that is very agricultural. They love looking at animals of the field. It is an extension of their passions and what their entire life revolves around. So whatever you enjoy doing most, this is what we see from Leah and Rachel. Leah means a cow or calf. Rachel means a lamb or a sheep. And flocks are flocks. But the names are to reveal a different aspect of one of the beauties of shepherding. So different needs. And we're going to see that in chapter 30 a lot. Leah has different needs than what Rachel has. Rachel has different demands than what Leah has. And because of the way that Jacob responds to both Leah and Rachel, we're going to see that God's going to bless one more than the other, at least in the beginning. But then we're going to see that God is going to ultimately bless the one who was most loved last. And there's an interesting parallel with that. So Laban's actions, you look at his childhood whenever Rebekah was taken back in chapter 24, there was actually a statement made to Abraham's servant from Laban and his mother. Can the girl stay with us at least 10 days? Interesting. It even seems like in Laban's early days, he had separation issues. Well, we find later in his life, when he's in control, he abuses his power for the sake of his personal gain. Now, in oppressing the one, and even God's going to call him out on this when we look in chapter 31. I think it's about verse 11, 12, and 13. An angel of the Lord came to Jacob and said, I see what Laban has done to you, and it's not right. What he's done to you is wrong. But God has blessed you, just like he's blessed Abraham, and he's blessed your father Isaac, and he will bless you richly despite this oppression. So when I look at the wages of Laban, I think a word we could associate with Laban is the wages of deceitfulness. Deceitfulness. Now there is an application with that. When I choose to deceive others, and Lord forbid myself, I will lose it all. And that is what happens to Laban at the end of 31. Now I want to look at a in-between here. In chapter 29, verse number 31, to chapter 30, verse number 24, we need to remember the Bible was not written with verses or chapter divisions. Take those out and you will begin to see an ongoing narrative. This is basically Battle of the Babies. Leah is married to Jacob. Rachel is married to Jacob. And at some point, normally it is the case, ladies will want to have a baby. And from Leah and Rachel, they make this a contest of sorts. Who can have children first? What is interesting in verse 31, this sets the tone for how this exchange is going to happen. Leah is going to have the first 4 children, followed by the handmaiden of Rachel is going to have child 5 and 6. That would be Bilhah. Then Leah gives her handmaiden to Jacob to have children, and that would be Zilpah. And then we find that child 9 and 10 are going to come from Leah, and then 11 and 12 are going to come from Rachel. Why that order? I don't know, but there are some intriguing things that I do find from this. I want you to notice when the Battle of the Babies begin in verse 31, I think this is part of the reason maybe God did what He did in the manner in which things played out. Notice in verse 31, it would say, when the Lord saw, this chapter 29, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, He opened her womb. But Rachel was barren. Not an unfamiliar fact to us that in the ancient days, and I would think maybe to a certain degree today, no, there are clinics because there are women who have been put into depression because they simply cannot have children. It was not good if you could not have children. And it was seen at times, wrongly so, that God had something against the woman who could not conceive a child. That is not what the Bible tells us. And there is something different that is being indicated. When it says that that the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, I want you to notice back in verse number 30, that after Jacob had married Rachel, he loved Rachel more than Leah. Does it sound like he's biased? Now, because Jacob worked all that time for Rachel, and he was swindled into marrying Leah, whom do you think Jacob would want to have all the babies in the world with? Rachel. Guess what God did not allow? Rachel to have children. As we look at these names for the children, it is interesting that there is a play on names as we go through this text. I don't have time to really fully flesh it out, but I have written them all out for you to read. I do want to note one thing of interest through this. When you look at child number 5 and child number, which should technically be 11, being Dinah. Dinah and the word Dan come from the same Hebrew root, which means I have been vindicated or one has answered my plea. Dinah is the feminine version of Dan in the Hebrew. What is interesting, that when Rachel has a child from Bilhah, she begins by saying, and Bilhah's child is number 5. So there's been at least a year, because if you consider 9 months, you've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. What is that? 3 years? 4? 3? Wait, 9, 12. It's a number. It's more than 2. I know that. Okay, so anywhere from 2 to 4 years. And we'll say maybe just being liberal-minded, maybe 5 years in total. But there's 11 children that have to happen, and this has to happen within 7 years have already happened with Leah. A week has already passed, so at least 7 years and a week. This has to be sometime during the second 7 years and or the 6 months in which the flock was being increased. So sometime within the 13 years, that's when these children are happening. If you want to get a gauge on how old or young Joseph was in comparison to his other brothers, just do some math through here and you'll find out there's about 10 to 18 years between Reuben to Joseph. Interesting to consider. But as I look at these names, and I look at Dinah and Dan, when Bilhah has her first child in regards toward Rachel, because Bilhah is Rachel's handmaiden, she begins by saying, God has finally vindicated me. He has answered my prayers. The score is, so to speak, 4-1. Did she really win? What is of interest is that the last child that Leah has herself, God has vindicated the unloved. He has answered my plea. Now, whether this also is a setup for chapter 34, Dinah's name does also mean judgment on another, which is what happens with Simeon, Levi, and Shechem and his crew towards Dinah, which is called the Dinah incident. So Rachel begins with the very first one. Yes, God has done it for me. But Leah waits to the very end and says, see all that God has done. I want you to consider what God has done early in your life versus what He does now. Which one's even more sweet? The start of His blessings or the end of His blessings? And I know His blessings go on forever, but the ending is always better. Remember the story of Job. Remember James chapter 5. The end intended by the Lord. He was even more prosperous. He was more blessed in the end than he was in the beginning. Young people fail at this frequently. Just because I'm where I'm at does not mean I am where God sees I can be. I will not know until I get to the end. Now, there's something that young people struggle with, and older friends will say that. What is something you've experienced that has really helped put life into perspective? And here's a hint. You have to do it every single day. There is the dead and the living. You live. If you have not lived from day to day to day to day, then you do not, well, you did not, probably when you were younger, actually understand God's will for your life. Not as much in comparison to where you are now. When you consider a marriage relationship, should it be the case that God forbid and God comfort those who experience the end of that bond? Should the beginning be even greater than the end, or the other way around? The end is much greater. You are much closer. You are more in tune with one another. There is a deeper intimacy of sorts, not just on the pleasure level, but on the psychological level, because you understand one another better. It's as if two have become one flesh. When I consider the story here, Leah waited to the very end to say, God has heard my cause. Rachel, like the impatient youthfulness, says in the first case, God has heard my cause. Both are important. But as I look at the outcome of all this, Leah has 6 children, 6 sons, 1 daughter, 7 children. Her handmaiden Zilpah has 2 children. That makes a grand total of 9. Rachel has her handmaiden first give birth. Sound like another woman in the book of Genesis where the handmaiden gave birth before she did? How about the father of promise? But Bilhah had 2. Rachel only had 1. And when she had the second child, Benjamin, which she named Ben-Oni, it tells us she was having birthing difficulties, and she died in the birthing process. So where she was naming Benjamin, son of my sorrows, I will not get to see him grow. I will not get to care for him. I must leave him in the hands of others. And look real careful at that text. It says, as her soul was departing, she had but fleeting moments. Jacob, on the other hand, renamed him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. Thought for your own studies. As you read through the names of the sons of Jacob, see if there is not a connection to Jesus. He is the man of sorrows, but he is also Son of the God Most High, sitting at the right hand of the Father. Which perspective do you see Jesus in? God of my pain? God of my blessings? So as I look at these names, interesting to see how they develop and how they are named. And in this battle, ultimately, both of them are blessed. But the bigger thing to take into consideration as we transfer from the blessings God gave, I want us to look at chapter 31, and I want us to look at a statement that Rachel and Leah both make to Jacob. Genesis 31, I want you to notice in verse 14, 15, and 16. This is after the 20 years have transpired, and Jacob is having a powwow with Rachel and Leah about Laban and leaving the land. Notice what they would say. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. And they're alluding to what God had said in the verses prior, in verse 12 and 13. I've seen all that Laban is doing. Get up now and go back down to the land of the south. So Jacob had a God-given command. You get up and go. It is time to leave. Now, I want us to consider what his 2 wives said. They're not bickering with each other, but they're saying, I believe it's time to go. Our father has taken everything from us. He has sold us. He has taken our money. Everything that rightfully belongs to us, he has taken. I want us to look as we move from the God of delightfulness. Laban is deceitfulness. God is delightfulness, at ourselves. We do not have time to flesh out all 3 applications, I am well aware. And one of them we have already talked about in lessons past. But as I look at the wages of my life, I am looking at dependableness. This is not about God. I find myself flustered when I go to God in prayer and in my shame accuse Him for not giving me what I want most. And as I look at the first application, am I a liar or a laborer? A liar or a laborer? Here's what I mean. James chapter 5, he would say that we are to let our yes be yes and our no be no. I want you to think about this, and parents, this is really big. Grandparents, this is really big too. When people are put into our trust, and we find a moment where we could expose those who we have influence over either to more ways of the world and making decisions to go participate in things of the world in place of God. I want you to consider the type of exchange you are willing to make for the person you have influence over. When I look at the character of who God is and the promises that we make as we become children of God, I want you to notice these 4 things. As we become Christians, there are 4 different promises that we make, whether to one another or to those around us or to God. Promise number 1, protective promises. When you become a child of God, I am not to be a brown-noser in your life, but I am accountable for the fact of Galatians 6. Any of you who are spiritual see a brother that is overtaken in a trespass. You go do what? Comfort him. James 5. Any of you sick? Pray. Pray especially, 1 John 3, that it not be a sin unto death. I pray, John would say, do not pray for that. In other words, don't pray that people continue in their sins. When we become children of God, I misspelled protective. Now it's misspelled forever. Protective promises. When I become a child of God, I have vowed to God, I will watch out for you, and you will do the same for others. Promise number 2. And I need this for this marker. Patient promises. Patient promises. Now, what I mean by this is that when I consider the growth of the church, the growth in my life, the blessings that God gives me, I want you to know that when someone hears the news, you're going to be a father or you're going to be a mother. I have never seen someone the next day flip tables and say, God, why aren't they graduating college today? It takes time for those things. Oftentimes, in more trivial matters, where's the job I've been asking for? Where's the spouse I've been asking for? Where's the children I've been asking? The home I've been, the paycheck I've been, the clothing, the car. Good things come to those who are patient. When I become a child of God, I have agreed to being patient with God's promises. You know what I do not find Jacob doing in this whole 20-year excursion? He does not buckle on God and say, it is time to pay up. You promised I would be good. This ain't good. He never once said that. Number 3, productive. Productive promises. When we consider passages like Titus chapter 2, verse 11 through 15, chapter 3, 1 through 11, and verse 14, it would tell us that God has redeemed for Himself a peculiar people, a special people, zealous for good works. It is wonderful that we pray that the community be moved by what we as a congregation do. Flip side, in praying for good things to be done in the community, we must be doing something in the community. I cannot pray that God gives it rain, I come outside without any umbrella and say, I knew it. Faith without works is dead. So when I look at the promise I've made to God, am I being productive in His kingdom? And the last one, precious promises. The Bible often and frequently would say that God has made unto us, 2 Timothy 3:14 and 15, precious and exceedingly great promises both for the life that now is and for the life that is to come. John chapter 4, verse 34 through 38, Jesus would tell the woman at the well, there are great things that are going to happen in the future. Even John afterward would say, this is the bridegroom, bless you, this is the bridegroom that we've been waiting for. But when I look at the promises of God and I see all the incredible things that God has in store for your life, for my life, and I begin to be impatient with God, I fail to be productive because I don't see the dividends and the payoff, and I fail to be protective in light of others who are around me. It's as if I just don't care not only about God, I don't care about any of you anymore. How has it blessed me when I've been faithful to God? Beautiful thing about Jacob's life, I do not see him saying those things. Which moves us to our last application. When I look at point B, there is a weird story in the Battle of the Babies where Reuben goes out, it implies he's about 6 years old to maybe 10 years old. He goes out and he finds some mandrakes. Well, mandrakes in the ancient world were very accustomed to, if you were going to try for a baby, that the male would take of the mandrakes and it would provide a fertility supplement so that it would allow conception. When Reuben found the mandrakes, Reuben is Leah's firstborn. Rachel said, "Hey Leah, give me some of your son's mandrakes." Translation, "Hey, can I be with your man?" How's that going to go over? Well, they're wives of the same man, but that's her son. That's Leah's son. Rachel is the enemy. So here's the exchange Rachel makes. Okay, how about this? I will give you one night with Jacob, and I will get that in return to mandrakes. Maybe the mandrakes will make me fertile. What is interesting in the text is that Leah ended up conceiving from this event, not Rachel with the mandrakes. Now, what's even more interesting about this? Point B is, am I looking for mandrakes rather than the maker? Rachel swore up and down, if I just get more mandrakes, maybe there's just something naturally wrong with me. And there was. God closed up her womb. But whenever Joseph was born, it would actually say that when Joseph was born, it would say that God shall add to me a son. And when you look at verse 22, it would say, then God remembered Rachel. I wonder if maybe our viewpoints of how my way is so much better, and God, if you look at all the great things I've done, you look at all the hard work I've done, and you look at all the pain and suffering and the agony that I'm going through internally and the issues I'm facing outside, God, if only you knew. Close your mouth, you idiot. When you consider how grand and eternal God is, do you not think God knows that? He is eternal. He is the one who made you. He saw you from the creation of the world. My viewpoint, your viewpoint is very limited to this thing called time. God is the only one who is called the everlasting. And when you dare get fed up with God and you become weakened in faith, like unfortunately we have some brethren and sisters here who have an issue with God because He's not doing it on their timetable. Shame on you. What about values? Matthew chapter 6. Wherever your treasure is, there your heart is also. Some translations have it backwards. Where your heart is, that's where your treasure is also. Do not lay up for yourselves in heaven treasures where rust, moth and rust doth corrupt, where thieves break in and steal, but rather lay up for yourselves heavenly treasures where rust and moths do not break through. There cannot be any thieves that steal. I wonder if maybe my interest were things that interested God, the same way the proverb writer would say in Proverbs 23, verse 4, do not overwork to be rich. How many people miss services because I picked up an extra shift for money? Do not overwork to be rich. But I'm having a hard time. We're not talking about that. People who are greedy for money, it would say, because of your own understanding, cease. Will you not set your eyes on that which is not? Riches certainly will make themselves wings. They will fly like an eagle toward heaven. Lastly, victory. When I fail to understand the viewpoint of God's prescription to my problems, because it's coming from the eternal God who loves me more than I will ever love myself, more than ever mom or dad has ever loved me, grandparents or sibling has ever loved me, and I take an investment in His values, there is the victory. Victory through the life of Ethan Tate alone will not turn out well. And God has told me that through His Word. God has told you that through His Word. I want you to consider it in closing. Rachel was probably the last one to have a child because she kept trusting in all the physical processes. She was not thinking about God. Think about it. When they're leaving the land, who took the father's idols? Rachel. Chapter 35, Jacob had to say again to Leah and Rachel, put away your idols. Someone could not let go of worldliness, thinking, but it works for them. Surely it will not play out well for you. The Bible is interesting when we think about events that always happen in our life. Here's a big one that even Rachel and Leah and Jacob are experiencing now. Eternity. When we refuse to give things up to God in God's ways, we will not receive the wages that God has in savings for you. Talked about our Father before. He is not willing to come back, and the children have had a conversation together. You know, if Dad's going to come back, we're going to have to do this God's way, or He will continue to be lost in His sins. The things we think will work most when we do not want to trust God will never work out the way we want to. When we give things to God the way that God desires, they will always turn out even better than we could ever imagine before. What's keeping you from following God? Look into Rachel's life, look into Leah's life, see how God blessed them when they finally turned to God and said, that is my Dan, that is my Dinah. God has given me the victory through Him. Thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back in just a few moments.
The song of invitation tonight will be hymn number 6.
Okay, so that's on. Okay, sweet. Then what's the number?
683.
Okay, 683. Gotta remind that. 683, 683. Got it.